Today, I want to talk a little bit about death and dying and how we are often prepared for it and for our grief resulting from it by our loved ones who are dying. This is a very fresh issue for me this week, so forgive me. I'm going to be reading off of paper because I don't trust myself to be able to say this without the prompting. My purpose today is to illustrate how we are prepared by sharing a recent experience in the life of myself and my family. So over the holidays, I took some time off and I had the opportunity to listen to a podcast of my mentor, Slade Roberson. In this particular episode, he was speaking with Dr. Jo Atkins, who works with the dying, about deathbed visions. When I was in grad school, one of my particular focuses was on death and dying, probably because in my first year, my last remaining grandmother developed lung cancer and was under hospice care. I was a hospice volunteer and I read all sorts of books about death and dying from spiritual perspectives, religious perspectives, physical perspectives, you name it. I probably read about it. I read about ministering to the dying, and this was a particular focus of mine because because my focus in grad school was health communication. Particularly, I wanted to be a patient advocate, and so I wanted to train people help people to take control as much as possible of their health care and of the care of their loved ones. So somehow in the intervening years after grad school, I'd basically forgotten about that specialty, about how much I had learned. And but listening to the podcast between Slade and Dr. Atkins brought it all back to me, and it brought me peace. And I was very happy to know that this woman and her organization exist to help people transition from this life to the next, because it is a holy and important thing, I believe. And after listening to the podcast, I immediately downloaded her book, Signposts of Dying, and read it. I even wrote a review about it on Amazon. I liked it so much. I wondered once or twice while reading and listening why this was coming up in my life again. And I figured maybe I was supposed to revisit some of the lessons about the deeper meanings of life that I had learned during that time when I'd been focusing on this aspect and when my grandmother had been dying. So a week after we got back from visiting my family, for Christmas and New Year, last Saturday, our 14-year-old cat, who we had adopted as, I think, a 10-month-old kitten, developed a growth on his chin. And it was nothing major. We figured he'd had this happen before, and it had just been a matter of going to the vet and having them lance it and then give him an appropriate antibiotic for what they found had caused the infection. He had just been checked out by the vet a couple of weeks before we left for Christmas, so mid-December, and they'd given him a clean bill of health other than his kidney disease, which we knew about because he was such an old cat. And on Sunday, the next day, the growth was actually much larger. So I called the vet's office and left a message so that we could be seen, hopefully on Monday. Long story short, the vet couldn't see him on Monday, and so we had to schedule an appointment for Tuesday. Later that day, on Monday, however, the growth had actually ruptured, and anyway, we noticed that he was stumbling around, and so we called several vets, but no one could get him in. Everybody was booked completely, and finally, after quite some time, we managed to find a local vet that had several cancellations and could fit him in. And so we had to wait for a bit when we finally got there. And my son picked up a book while we were waiting, and it was called Cat Heaven. As soon as I opened the cover, the cover was plain. It was a hardback plain cover book, and when I opened it and saw the title, I immediately thought, here it is. I had already thought that we would probably We're seeing the last day after seeing what had happened with our older cat, but I'll get to that in a little while. So it was cat heaven, and the kids requested that I read the book, and so I did, and I was actually amazed at how calm I stayed while reading it until we got to the part about the cats sitting outside the homes of the families who had loved them and watching over their families. And then I had to stop for a little bit to keep the tears at bay so I could keep reading to the kids. So the kids were just asking me, I finished reading the book, and the kids were just asking me to read it again when the vet came in and said that we could take the cat back. So she did an exam, filled him full of fluids, and said that there was probably more going on, like probably a tumor, and she gave him an antibiotic shot and said that it should work within 48 hours if it was going to work. As I mentioned, I had seen our previous cat through to the end a few years ago. He had died of kidney disease, and I'd been alone with him that day and had a friend came to stay with me, but he had been through much the same process. We'd called the vet, couldn't get in, etc. And so I'd had to endure watching him die. It had been, again, I often call it a holy experience. It wasn't exactly pleasant or calm, but it was holy. So I recognized the signs in Maury, like I said, that he was close to dying. But we weren't necessarily ready to face that, and so we had the vet give our cat some fluids and the shot, and so he started to perk up a little bit, so we took him home and hoped for the best. Once we got home, Maury still couldn't walk, and he stayed in one place on the living room floor. So we made a pallet of blankets on the floor, and my husband, my daughter, and I slept in the living room with the cat that night. I slept terribly, and I awakened frequently because the cat was crying right next to me. He would cry when he would try to get up, and the floor was hard and cold, and I knew he had to be uncomfortable. So I did my best to comfort him and soothe him. I knew that was the best I could do, having again been trained and prepared as much as one can be prepared. So the next day, on Tuesday, the cat was barely moving, and my husband had an idea to fill a box or a crate with blankets to keep him in so he'd be warm and as comfortable as possible. We basically decided to keep the crate in the living room with my husband and the kids, unless the kids got too distracting. And he was there, wrapped up in his blankets, or lying on top of his blankets with one lightly covering him. And so, noisy kids, the occasional shout. The cat, he cried out occasionally, and he was comforted. We pet him anytime we walked by. And then when I left the office at the end of my work day and went to give him a customary scratch, I found that he had died. It was late on a cold winter day, and so knowing the ground was covered with ice and snow and that it would be probably frozen solid, we didn't want to go bury him immediately. We knew that the next couple of days were going to be warm in the 50s, a rarity. So we decided we would bury him the next day. So we put the crate up in our picture window, and so he could look out over the family one last time, like the cats in cat heaven. So he was inside the house at least, but watching over the family. And the next morning we buried him in our orchard. We mourned. We are still mourning, as you can see. I think in some ways it may be easier for me. I think in some ways it's easier for us because we were prepared, and we often don't see that the people who are dying, even those who die suddenly, what we think is suddenly, are often prepared, and they may not even know they're preparing us. But in this case, I think we were prepared, and I'll explain why. He and our guides prepared us for his passing. The vets didn't notice anything abnormal at his checkup only 2 weeks before Christmas. And I think that was so we could have an enjoyable holiday as a family without having anxiety about him. And then over the holiday, I listened to that podcast, even though I hadn't listened to a podcast for months. And that was the only podcast I listened to over the holiday, by the way. And listening to it and reading Dr. Atkins's book, like I said earlier, brought back all the memories of all that I'd forgotten that I knew about death and dying, and how peaceful and moving an experience it can be, and not in a negative way. In addition to all of that, once we were back home from the holiday, our cat acted normally for a full week. He spent a little more time than usual curled up with me, which was odd because he is definitely my husband's cat. He's always been a man's cat, and especially my husband's cat. And then the sore displayed on a weekend when we couldn't get him to see a vet, and it got worse. And again, it's strange that we couldn't get into the vet that had never had a problem getting him in the 13 years that we had been going to this vet. We'd always been able to get him in when we needed to, especially in an emergency, and this time it couldn't be done. So basically that delayed him being seen, but for us, that delayed him being seen until it was too late for us to do anything about it. So we couldn't prolong his suffering. It also meant that he'd been having, as he aged, a lot more trouble traveling. He loved traveling as a kitten, but it had gotten harder and harder for him over the years. And so it also meant that by the time we found a vet who could see him, it was an 8-minute ride away rather than a 40-minute ride on peaceful roads rather than very busy, hectic roads and through a town. And the vet we managed to find who had an opening, she didn't sugarcoat anything, but she also didn't insist that we put him down. But she didn't give us false hope either. And the fluids and antibiotics that she gave him, they gave him just enough comfort to be able to pass the next 24 hours in our home relatively peacefully and comfortably, so he could live, not in too much pain, and so he could die surrounded by his family and who loved him. Even the book that my son picked up in the vet's office, with its plain hardcover and nothing obvious to attract him to it, it was preparing us. It gave us the language and words that we could use to explain to our children death, because they haven't really encountered it before. And most especially, it gave them enough words and concepts and pictures so that they could frame questions to us. And I think that was very helpful, especially for them. Without that book, I probably wouldn't have explained death in a way that was accessible or understandable for the kids. And but the book, it offered terms that were accessible and that I wouldn't immediately default to, but that were beautiful and comforting and close enough to my own beliefs that I could easily explain them to the kids. Finally, he died just a few hours before a 2-day unseasonably warm period. So the ground was thawed enough so we could give him a really nice burial, so much as you can have such a thing. So some people might say it's wishful thinking that the dying prepare us. But I've learned over the years, by studying death and dying and communicating with spirit and spending so much time with the dying in hospice care and in other settings, and then I know that we all, including animals, we have a say in when and how we go. I know that all my experiences with the dying have been transformative for me and beautiful, again, even if not always peaceful. They are deeply moving and they are intentional. That is the message that I felt called to share with all of you today. Grief is normal and it is natural, but there is a certain beauty and grace that is extended around the time of death by the dying being to us and by spirit to the dying being and to us. And if we give ourselves over to that grace, we can also extend it to the dying and to ourselves by simply being in the moment and accepting what happens, by comforting the dying and witnessing it, rather than denying it and turning away. It's not easy, but few things that are worthwhile are easy. Death is a natural part of life, and it can be just as beautiful as birth. And in fact, it is a birth of sorts, out of this dimension into another one. And the energy of our loved ones lingers a while, or steps back in occasionally, while we mourn and grieve, and gently pulling us as they gently pull away to their new life, and we become more and more capable of dealing on our own. Preparations were made to strengthen us, to prepare us, and our loved ones see us through, even after their passing.